So I would like to thank you, Danielle, for joining me on this interesting conversation about desistance.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, it's a pleasure. So let's start off with some definitions. I think most people probably know, but just to have an expert opinion, what is desistance?
So desistance is, it's usually used in the legal literature. So I think sort of cease and desist. So desist is something and then maintaining the stopping of the thing. So a cease and desist is, stop it and continue not doing it. So desistance is, I have previously described it as the opposite of recidivism, but that's obviously way too simplistic because recidivism is a slippery outcome variable where it can be measured at different times and it can be operationalized in different ways. Recidivism can mean, reincarceration or reconviction or rearrest. Recidivism in our world can mean for a sexual offense or a violent offense or, a parole revocation or whatever. And recidivism can also be measured by police or by parole officer, probation officer, but also self-report. So, and of course, so much of it goes unreported. So desistance similarly is difficult to measure because desistance is something not happening, right? Your outcome variable is the absence of offending. So that's difficult to put into a spreadsheet, and difficult to know whether you've actually, observed desistance or just the person going to ground and not being caught or whatever. But generally speaking, in the literature, desistance is considered a natural human process and then the natural evolution of things in terms of offending. And it's certainly been understood much more thoroughly in criminological literature in terms of, the majority of people who engage in offending will at some point stop that offending, will stop engaging in that behavior.
It's too much energy.
Okay, sorry.
No. I guess eventually it takes too much energy to commit crimes.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different, there's I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Yeah.
There's the sort of hardcore, traditional crim routine activities argument that it starts to get difficult to run around at night dressed in black, carrying big TVs. It's difficult. Like once you get married and have kids, it's just harder to, go out at night and do drugs and stuff because you've got these states in conformity, but also it's just nobody's got the time because you've got these other routine activities that are keeping you from doing these naughty things out, out at night, still like this sort of classic story of a cat burglar and, that sort of stuff like that becomes too difficult.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the last time that I had to sneak back into my house because I got locked out, and over time it gets harder and harder to like break into people's places. Not that I have broken into anybody's places, but
of course.
Yes,
allegedly.
that's allegedly right. So that certainly makes sense. So for your book on desistance, you interviewed many men who have been committed as sexually dangerous. So how did that come about?
So a lot of the research, I have had studied criminology and always felt like a bit of a fish out of water at some psychology conferences or, with psychologists who took a very individual, a focus on individual difference. And criminology takes a much more sociological approach. We can explain these kinds of behaviors through much more generic variables. And I was always fascinated by why criminology didn't even hazard a guess as to what caused sexual offending. There was always this, oh, well, that's a psychological problem. But criminology is the study of crime, and a sexual crime is a crime, no? So why shouldn't criminology be able to explain sexual offending in the same way that it can explain other offending? And it turns out that some people had tried to do that previously, but a lot of criminology is a lot of sort of traditional American criminology really is around explaining juvenile delinquency and explaining fairly minor offending. And it frustrated me that there was no way to really explain the, you know, the hardcore, much more serious stuff, because that's the stuff that you're interested in when you're a criminology student. You know, you want to explain the serial killers and the rarer cases. And so there had been a study on desistance from non-sexual offending, and so mostly looking at violence and property offending and a lot of drug offending. And it seemed to me to be interesting to look at, you know, the far extreme of that was these sexually violent predators, people that have been labeled as sexually dangerous for the foreseeable future, and people that had been civilly committed based on the fact that they would never be able to be cured or, you know, fixed or anything. But these people were also being released from custody and were apparently no longer offending. So I just wanted to understand that. And I think one of the other arguments that might be easier to cut all that other stuff I just said, in criminology, there are theories of why people commit crime, and there's all different manner of explanations. And then there's a stream of criminology that seeks to explain why some people don't commit crime. Like maybe we can better explain why some people do if we explain why some people don't. And there's explanation of social bonds and, you know, social control and self-control and that sort of an attachment. But there wasn't really an explanation of, you know, there's onset and why do some people start young and then continue reoffending, and why do some people start as adults and whatever. And we know about adolescent limited offending and people sort of age out, but there wasn't really an explanation of why people who have committed offences in the past stop doing that particular thing in their later years or in adulthood, other than aging out. So yeah, I just wanted to answer that question.
How did they respond to your contact, to reaching out to them about your effort?
So when it started, I had a couple of colleagues who were working in the community with guys who had been released, and as you know, in the US, a lot of people that are released still have to go to treatment each week or still have to check in with their probation officers each week. And obviously there's a lot of tracking and management that goes into post-custody supervision and community supervision. So I reached out to a couple of those places and I went to visit the group treatment programs and said, you know, talked to the guys and said, I'm doing this research. I want to know what works. I want to know what helped. To be honest, I'm really sick of going to conference after conference and hearing about recidivism, and how, you know, 10% of the sample, 10% of this sample recidivated and 12% of that sample did. Does that not mean that 80 to 90% didn't? Why don't we tell that story? And wouldn't it be interesting to know, where can we unpack that? And can we, you know, is it that 100% are actually offending, but you're only catching 12%? Or is it that some of these people never did it to start with, or some of these people stopped or got better at it and now they do it but don't get caught? Or can we just look at that bigger number? The recidivism statistics were frustrating to me, because the flip side of that is that surely that means that most people are not reoffending. And if you want to prevent something and you want to know what works, shouldn't you ask the people that are doing well what worked rather than what didn't work? Because I think we're pretty good now at knowing what doesn't work. And so I just wanted to take a more positive perspective. And I remember talking to the guys and, you know, I'd say, does anybody know what desistance means? And I mean, word still gives it a red wiggly line, which, to be honest, I just find offensive because it's a legit word. But anyway, nobody knew what desistance was, but they all understand recidivism. Even the guys who, you know, might have limited education and you know, maybe haven't studied higher education or whatever, but everybody in the room knows about recidivism. And they're all ready to tell you about what that means, and that, you know, having that stigma, this sort of, they're constantly at risk, and they're they know exactly what that means. And so when I came in and said, look, I want to tell the other story. I want to know what works. I want to know what helped. I want to know what happens when you get up in the morning, and, you know, what you do with your day, and let's just sort of talk about what's happened in your life since you've been released. Let's tell that story. And there was a really big appetite for them to share that. There were a lot of people in the interviews who would say, like, I would ask them those questions. What did you always want to do when you grew up? Or, you know, what were you good at when you were a kid? And what do you want to do with your life now? And so many of them would say, gosh, nobody's asked me that before. But, you know, there's such an emphasis on what were you thinking when you did it? And what were you thinking in the moments leading up to it? Or what were you thinking in the years leading up to it? Or what happened to you when you were 7? Or all of that stuff, which are great questions and need to be asked. But when, you know, people often say, oh my gosh, how could you do that? How could you sit with them and talk to them? Because I was sitting with a 3-dimensional human being who was more than the label and was more than their offense. And in that moment, when I was talking to them and talking to this 3-dimensional human being who had a family, you know, they all came from somewhere. They all have connections. They've all got, most of them have children. All of them have parents. You know, I just wanted to look past that. And I got to the point where either, look, I think one interpretation is I got to the point in stats where it got too hard and I didn't like it anymore. And an alternative explanation is I got to the point where looking at a cell, you know, looking at cells in a table just wasn't cutting it anymore. Yeah, I had access to data with 3,000 variables on 570 people, but, you know, marital status is not a 1 or a 0. And I just, using those binary variables and dichotomous variables to say, you know, you've either lived with someone for 2 years or you haven't. And so you're either a 1 or a 0. When I was talking to actual human beings, it was more complicated than that. And so a spreadsheet in Excel or SPSS isn't enough. You can't tell those stories with numbers.
It's really striking how we tend to reduce the people that we work with to that offense, to those particular times. I remember when I was doing treatment, I had men, I did Spanish-speaking treatment, and I had a couple of guys from Puerto Rico. And
you were the one person who did Spanish-speaking treatment.
Yes, I was. With some other people.
How many other people?
There were a couple of others, but never. When I was there was a time where there were 2 of us, but the other person was doing most of the treatment because I had a lot of administrative duties. But it was a lot of fun because the other guy and me were in training sex offender treatment. So we started doing kind of like general treatment as we learned the techniques and all of that. So we started by, okay, talk about yourselves, you know, where are you from, blah, 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 blah. And two of the men who had been in treatment literally for about 15 to 20 years together learned that they grew up in the same neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And it was the first time. So it's really sad, I think, that we lose from the psychological perspective the idea that we're talking to a person who commits something horrible, but who is a person who has goals and dreams and stressors and talents and all kinds of things that that it is striking that they reacted as would be expected. You are interested in me as a person, and there's a lot more, and so that's okay. So that's really, really good. What worked for them? And I'm dying to ask you, what do they think of treatment?
Yeah, well, I think as I am realizing with so many parts of life in general, right? Parenting and just everything, and diet, for example. Some things work for some people some of the time, and some things work for some people for a short period and then they stop working. And some things don't work, and then you try them a different way, or you try them at a different period in your life, and then they're more successful. So in the same way that, you know, every hairdresser and taxi driver since the beginning of my career has said, oh my gosh, after they find out what I do. And then the question is always, why do they do it? And I say, well, you know, I interviewed 50 people, there's 50 different reasons. Then I'd interviewed 65 people and there were 65 different reasons. And now I've interviewed 100 and there's 100 different reasons. There's exactly the same number of reasons why people stop as to why they start. And some of them, I've sort of toyed with the idea of a desistance assessment in this. It's sort of a flip of a risk assessment. You know, what can we assess chance for success? And for example, one of the things might be, you know, has family to live with. And for some people, going back home and living in your mother's basement isn't necessarily a step forward and would be problematic. And for some people, moving in with their elderly mother would seem like, you know, an extra burden. And for some people, it gave them this extraordinary reason for living because they had somebody that they needed to get up to help every day. They had a reason to get to bed because they needed to take their mum to therapy, or they needed to take their mum to the doctor, or they had to do a pharmacy run or something. And so, you know, what might look like a burden, or what might look like a caregiving role, and what might look like a problem or a liability, was actually really fantastically inspiring. For other people, it was just getting a job. It was just doing something with their time every day. For some people, it was getting into a routine. And I mean, whether that was as menial as I just ride the train every day, I just get up and I ride the train, and I make sure that I'm not, like, for example, one guy I remember, he just didn't want to be in the homeless shelter during the day because he knew that there were people there that were going to be bad influences on him. So he made sure that he just took the train, and that was his thing. Other people made sure that they went to AA every day, and that was what they needed to do. I think one of the most powerful things across the board was connection. So whether that's connection to friends, or connection to family, or connection to their probation officer, or connection to a therapist, it was connection to a human being.
Well, it is. Isolation is more dangerous than smoking or drinking or other stuff.
I think absolutely, yeah. I've heard people talk about that the Department of Corrections should be the Department of Connections, and, you know, that connection is more powerful than correction, and that's all really great. You know, connection is the opposite of addiction. A great many mistakes have been made in the name of loneliness. I mean, a lot of, there were a couple of guys, I think I referred to them in the book as see, I'm going to blank on the name now, and I'm going to have to blame the time zone or something, but recluse. They were reclusive. That's right. There were guys who, you know, just said, like, I'm just going to stay in my cabin, and they've got blinkers on, and they're so concerned about being caught for something, not because they're going to reoffend, but because they are so hyper vigilant about the cops coming and taking them back to prison, because they know that if they put a foot right, like literally wrong, if they walk on the wrong side of the highway or the wrong side of the bus stop where, you know, children might gather, they could get pulled up at any time and they could go back to prison. So they stay in their cabin, and my job is just to not go back to prison. And the way that I do that is by not leaving my house. And so there were definitely a very small number of people that referred to, I think, what I would call their desistance strategy was one of being reclusive. They were not they didn't appear to be the ones who were particularly high functioning or the ones who were doing really well. You know, they appeared to be really struggling, but they were just as determined as the other guys to never go back to prison. And for them, that was their, you know, that was their strategy. That's how they were going to do it.
That sounds very stressful, though. Yeah. How did they see treatment?
Really, really interesting. I interviewed some guys who had been at a particular treatment center for I think the one guy was there for 38 years. So there were some people who had, and they said, you know, I remember the puppets. I remember that we had this puppet art therapy thing. And I remember then it's something that we don't think about, or that I didn't think about from a researcher perspective, and maybe that you don't think about from a practitioner perspective. But, you know, when the government changes, or when, you know, mental health takes over from corrections, or corrections takes over from mental health, or health and well-being comes in and they decide, you know, some psychology institute takes over from the justice system, and, you know, things change hands, then all of a sudden that manual from last month goes out the window and new clinicians come in. And this is the way that they were explaining it to me. Then all of a sudden we're told that, you know, the relapse prevention model's out and now we have to do good lives. And how am I supposed to think about spirituality and creativity when, you know, last week we were talking about triggers and risk and whatever. And so there were some of them who really took, especially the guys who came into the facility with a degree of social competence beforehand, right? So they were educated and they had studied, and they came in and they had done all of the reading and found it quite frustrating that, you know, they were sort of selling us this thing, and then all of a sudden the next month we were being sold this new thing. Some of them talked about how especially, it was one particular group of guys that thought that the treatment that they were getting in the community was a bit too soft, and they really liked the homework that they were getting when they were in custody, and they really liked that they needed to complete this work and turn it in, and it was a bit more serious. And that now that they're in the community, it's sort of just for appearances. But then there were other guys who said, like this, the focus in the community is so much about surveillance. And I called it in the book the insurance of surveillance. Like, some of them are almost grateful. They would only go to the grocery store. They'd only go to grocery stores that they knew had CCTV, because that was their insurance. They knew that they couldn't get caught for anything. So they would try and make themselves almost be on video every second that they're not in their house, because then when they get accused of something, because this is the sort of Damocles that's hanging over their head, right? When, as soon as they get accused of something, they can say, check the tape, like those tapes recorded, you know, and being maintained. And so there was sort of an insurance of surveillance, but there are also some people, like the reclusive guys that I mentioned, who found that incredibly, not just stigmatizing, but crippling. You know, I can't move, I can't do anything, I can't, and I think the frustration of that, the guys who felt like they were constricted, and that every single move was being watched, also really struggled, because they had been cleared by a court. They'd been cleared by psychiatrists. They'd been cleared by a judge, you know, and they'd say like a jury found me to be no longer sexually dangerous and I'm no longer at risk, but now I still have to do this treatment program every week. And I still have to talk about how I'm at risk, and I still have to sign the thing that says sex offender, and I'm still on the register, and I'm still, you know, level 3 or whatever. And it's difficult to reconcile that in your head when you've walked out the front door of the court and been told that you are no longer sexually dangerous and you've been released. And yet there's still all of this, there's still a residual management that has to happen.
We're really like labels.
Yeah, yeah. So, some people like labels.
So the deviance label, the sex offender label. I mean, we're working on it. Men who commit sexual offenses, but the problem is when they are reduced to that label.
And I think predator, and you know, predator really implies, you know, rabid lion, monster. You know, it's there was two guys that I know I can think of clearly who had gotten access to their files through FOIA or something, and had found that they were like in black and white. Their files said that they were a psychopath, and one of them had gone to court, and this had been mentioned in his trial, and they, you know, they'd refer to it as a trial, but it was actually a hearing and whatever. So I'm using their words. It might not have actually been a trial in the legal sense of the word. But that, you know, and I would say, what did it feel like to be told that you were a psychopath? And I mean, it just, I think that does a number on you, you know, to be labeled in all of these different ways. And then some of them would, it's very hard to explain, not own it in like, you know, this is something that I'm proud of, but own it in, I've never been anything before, and this is the thing that I understand. This is the thing, like if you dropped out of school and you never got the chance to go to university, or you never got the chance to take a course on woodworking, or you never got a chance to pursue, you know, this like thirst for knowledge, this option of mastery, the desire for self-determination and self-actualization, if you never got any of that and you went to jail as a kid, and you know, had a horrific upbringing, and you spent your 20s and 30s in and out of custody, and now suddenly you're in a position where you're getting treatment 5 days a week for 7 years in a treatment facility. There was a weird sort of thing where, and again, I'm not a psychologist. You can edit all of this out, Alejandro, because I might be crazy. But in the absence of anything else, the fact that they got to spend 5 days a week learning about all of this human psychology stuff was putting something in that, I don't want to say sort of vat, you know, of emptiness, but there was something that they could geek out about. You know how you like find a new band that you love, or you find a new food product that you love, and you got to tell everyone about it, and it's so cool. There were some guys, small group of guys, who really seemed to, again, not own it with pride, like I'm a sex offender, but own it in like, I have an academic level of understanding of this, and I can explain my triggers, and I can explain. It was like they could geek out about their offending cycle. Again, not with any pride, and not particularly with any regret, but just like, this is, I can understand this, and this is the thing that I know about. And that was the thing that they had mastery over in some bizarre way. Does any of that make sense? Just, you know,
there's no editing here. It's all real.
Oh no. No, but I've also just realized that my daughter gave me a manicure, and that I just keep seeing my fingers of different colors coming. I'm like, oh, it'll be online. I can wear pajama pants. No one will know. But I use my hands to talk. So I apologize.
No, This stuff is real.
This is a real me.
No, but that's fascinating because in a sense, I was trained dynamically, and not that they were dynamic in my treatment, but psychodynamically.
Yeah.
And I see treatment as reparenting. And and we had men in the treatment center tell they freaked the hell out of a couple of clinicians. There were two young people in their 20s, male and female, and these like old guys told them like, oh, you're like our parents. And they came to my office all freaked out because, oh my God, what does that mean? And I'm like, well, that means that treatment is working. But there's this idea, that the treatment providers are kind of like parenting them. They're giving them attention. They're giving them positive reinforcement. So these individuals are saying, look, Ma, or look, Pa, I learned.
Yes. Yeah.
That's really interesting. My apologies. There's some lag in the Dr. Harris is actually in Australia right now. I'm gonna pause this and then start when it's better.
Okay.
All right, everybody, we're back. And as I said, Dr. Harris is in Australia. Right now for her is tomorrow, and for me it's for yesterday. Future. That's right. I always want to ask people down under, like, how's today shaping up? And it's just horrible. It's part of my dad jokes. But I think, and we're running a little bit out of time here, is that I think some of the takeaways is how individualized their needs are, how individualized things are going to work, and how things are not going to work, and that manualized treatment sucks. No, just kidding. It kind of does. It's a technique. It's something that needs to be used in order to have more conversations.
Well, I think the comment about manualized stuff, I want to be really clear that I'm not a clinician and would suck as a clinician. And that's why, I always start my presentations by saying, thank you to those of you in the room who actually do this work, right? Because I can think of few things that would be more difficult. And in the same way that it needs to be individualized, I think from a crim perspective, manualized criminal justice is also a bit silly, right? So I went through one of the things that I really struggled with in all of my research, and you can see it if you read all the if you have insomnia, I would recommend reading all of my work chronologically. And you can see, in the first one, I'm like, I'm not going to include the pornography guys because that's non-contact. And I'm not going to include the incest guys because there's some reason why, for some reason, rape and extrafamilial child molestation trumps intrafamilial abuse, which, we can have a whole extra conversation about that. And, now we don't call it pornography or prostitution. We call it child exploitation material and child trafficking and whatever. And actually, involvement in procuring and producing and disseminating child exploitation material is extraordinarily problematic, and we need to call it what it is. So I got to the point where I didn't want to have that critique of, but you've just got these, these guys who did these non-serious things. So I went, okay, fine. I'm going to go hard. I'm going to go, go big or go home. I'm going to get the guys who did the most horrible, serious, whatever, so that no one can critique no one can say that this wasn't serious stuff. And then they had to have done it over a certain amount of time, and they had to have done it a certain number of times. And so you can show frequency and severity and prevalence and whatever, to be able to show meaningful desistance. And in doing all of that, the point that I'm trying to make is I ended up, by the time I got to the book, I didn't exclude anyone. I didn't exclude the woman. I didn't exclude the men who got convicted of non-contact but had actually disclosed other things to me, or the guys who had got convicted of 7 things when they said they'd only done 3, or the guy that got convicted of 3 things but told me he'd done 26. All of that stuff, I put them all in, because when it comes down to it, when they are in the room, doing sex offender treatment, they are all treated the same. And for me, it was more about the way that the system and the people that, you know, look up Megan's Law and all that sort of thing are calling these people all sex offenders, and they're all predators. And they, like you said, you know, they're individualized. And so a manualized approach is only going to get you part of the way there. And I know we need to have systems for a reason, and that we need sentencing guidelines, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that they were all, and they said it too, one of the biggest themes to come out of it was that they were all tarred with the same brush. They were all in this bucket together. And, you know, and each of them had a reason why they shouldn't be in the same bucket as as these other guys, of course. But the fact is they were, and they were all being treated the same, and they were all being subject to the same level of management and the same level of intervention. And that's what became really interesting in terms of, you know, what united them more was the need for connection and the fact that they had all been exposed to this system.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're going to have to end there. I would like to thank you so much.
We've used up all the internet in Australia.
Really? I'm going to need to interview somebody in South Korea. They have killer internet there.
We've got good weather, but we don't have good internet.
Well, we're getting the weather here now. It's warming up a little bit too much, but anyway, so always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is great.
And we could, at one point, I will tell you on labels, I'll tell you the story of the man with a really not measurable IQ with autism, who totally had me fooled in the middle of the night when I was a college student working at a residential. It involved a yo-yo. I'll tell you next time I see you at a conference.
That's an awesome cliffhanger. I really look forward to coming back there soon. I think at the moment, 2022 is looking like the next time. So
yes.
Yeah.
Knock on wood.
Fabulous.
All right. Thank you very much, and
Thanks
good night
so
and good day.
Good day to me. Bye.
Bye.